Judge, you were going to tell some stories on the Boo for us.
The Boo's such a wonderful guy. He was truly a warm character, but gruff. And so his bark was terrible. But as I said, he lets you live another day. I'll give you a few examples. There was a fellow in my class, Thomas McDowell, who's a lawyer in York, South Carolina, who had to walk 120 tours.
Explain what a tour is, Judge. Some people don't know what that is.
A tour is a unit of time on the quadrangle. You go into barracks, those red and white check things. You line up, you have your M1 rifle, and you walk back and forth for an hour carrying the rifle. That's one tour. Horrible waste of time, and you only do them on leave time. 120 is the maximum you can get, and it is usually accompanied by 6 months restrictions to the campus. So it's the death sentence for a cadet. Well, Thomas McDowell did 6 months and 120 tours, and when he finished, he bronzed his shoes and gave them to the Boo. And the Boo displayed them in his office. And he would do things for you, and he would make you pay. Jackie Maybank of the Triplets in Charleston fame, I roomed with his brother Tommy, saw the Boo. His car was Green Comet, and they called it the Green Weenie because his wife needed special help driving the car. And you'd see him cruising the campus. Jackie's late for class, so he's hiding behind buildings and dodging, seeing the Boo. Gets the bond hall to go in, and there's the Boo standing there grinning, knowing where he was. He said, Jackie, of all people, had the nerve to say, Colonel, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're a lieutenant colonel in the Army, airborne ranger, and all you got to do is run around trying to catch me. He said, not try, Bubba. I got you. I went to him with a great request. We were seniors. And I don't want to embarrass the Citadel by saying this, but when I was there, unless you wanted to be a career in the military, I didn't much worry about the merits and such. In fact, I was the only officer walking tours, and the Commandant called me over and talked to me about that. And I pretty much said I didn't care about being a distinguished military student, and that wasn't well received, but I thought it would be better for someone else. Anyway,
that's that buck and authority thing again.
I had a friend who had never broken barracks that's staying overnight when you don't have a pass to stay overnight. And he was from Cleveland, Ohio, and he was pretty straight. And I said, man, you can't graduate the Citadel without breaking barracks. So I talked to him and 2 other guys in breaking barracks, and we did and stayed out, and we got turned in. I thought I had it arranged where we wouldn't get turned in, but plans don't always work. So, man, he was distraught because this was like 2 weeks before graduation. We'd finished our academic routine, the rest of the school still taking classes. And you wouldn't graduate if you were caught. So he was just mortified and scared to death. And so on a Sunday, I went over to quarters, and Colonel Cavazier was living on campus with his wife, and she was doing dishes, looking through the window, drying them or something. As I walked up, knocked on the door, she answers. I said, Miss Cavazier, might I see the colonel for a moment? Come on in, Cadet Duffy. She couldn't be any nicer. He's upstairs, and she says, Nugent, Thomas Nugent Cavazier, the Boo. Cadet Duffy is here to see you. Tell that bum to drive on up here. So I drive up his steps. He's laying on the bed, having just come back from Mass at St. Mary's, laid out with his coat and tie, reading the paper, big cigar. What do you need, Bubba? I said, Colonel, I need a weekend leave. Weekend leave? You graduate in 2 weeks? I said, yeah, but I need it for last weekend. He said, you Galdy, and he put a few expletives behind that. He said, I guess you've got a weekend leave coming, huh? I said, yes, sir, I still got weekend leaves available. I guess you got the form filled out. Yes, sir, here it is. I handed it to him, and he scribbles it, and he said, get out of here. I said, well, Colonel, before I go, I got one other thing. He said, what's that? I said, I've forgotten whether it was 2 or 3 other guys with me. He said, I don't believe you, Duffy. But anyway, he signed them for us, and we left, and those guys were much relieved. He let us graduate. But what he did show you the wit and the discipline that he would inject into it was he wrote us up for failing to sign out on weekend leave. And we had to sit confinements, which is like a tour, only you have to stay in your room with white gloves at your desk with a waist plate on. So all the rest of the 2 weeks, when everybody else went, we sat confinements every hour of the day till we graduated. But he let us graduate. That's the kind of fella he was. So my hat off to the boo. The other thing, and I'll quit here, after I was practicing law, he had a problem with some administration at the Citadel. He had 3 scholarships in his name at the Citadel, and they weren't being administered properly according to his point of view. So he came to see me. He said, Michael, I don't want to raise Cain with the Citadel and do all that. He said, but I'm going to do something if they don't correct these problems I have with the scholarships. I said, Colonel, don't worry about it. I'm sure I can get it fixed, which I did. And he came back. I told him I had it fixed, typical of his manner of expression. Look, yeah, Bubba, you know I ain't got no money. I said, Colonel, I don't want any money. I said, what I'd like is, how about an autographed picture? He said, you got it. He showed up in my office. They had done a portrait of him as a tribute. He's got on an army hat with a cigar in his mouth, and beautiful portrait. It doesn't sound it, but it is. And he autographed it to Michael, the great peacemaker. And I had it hanging in my chambers all these many years, and I now have it at home. But I think about him often. Enough of the boo.
Let me ask a couple of things while we're still on Citadel, Michael. What was your major at Citadel?
I started out in pre-med because I didn't know what I wanted to be. And I said, who makes a lot of money and doesn't have too much stress? A dentist. So that's pre-med. So I signed up for it. And then, I go to those chemistry labs, and sunny afternoons, you got a 3-hour lab and that kind of thing. I said, number one, I'm not qualified for this. I didn't even take chemistry in high school. And I don't like it. So anyway, after the first year, I switched to political science. And that's really what got me involved with the law. And I'm jumping ahead of you. But I took a course, and I'm amazed they offered it, and I don't know if they still offer it. May have been one professor that did, in admiralty law. And I love the history of that, is why I took it. But it hooked me on the law. And then they offered a course in constitutional law, and I took that. And I was hooked. Then I wanted to be a lawyer, and so that's what planted that seed.
Okay. Are there any other professors or people at Citadel that you feel like that had a special influence in your life other than the boo?
Academically, yes. Well, it was some TAC officers did too. But academically, this guy, H.B. Alexander in the English department. Arrogant, pain in the neck fellow, but the greatest English professor you could ever have. And I loved English, and I did well at it. And we used to call him Alexander the Great, and he loved that. And I did a lot of discussions with him about literature and life. And then there was another fellow named Charlie Flowers who taught in the political science department, who was the first fellow that kind of tied together the theory with the practice. And I spent a lot of time talking with him and talking about government and talking about law and everything else. And he was very kind to me. So those two fellows stick out in my recollection.
Okay. Now you finished, well, let me, what, if any, well, not, let me rephrase that. What do you think was the biggest influence the Citadel had on your life?
The Citadel, number one, you didn't have enough time to do everything, and that's what they intend for it to be. So you had to learn to prioritize things and focus and get them done. And as I look back on that, that has stood me in great stead my entire life, because you learn what's important and what isn't, and you go to it. And in practice of law, getting ready for a trial, and then during the course of a trial, it allows you to focus in a way that is perfect for training for a great cross-examination. And I go back to everything you did at the Citadel was best use of your time. The finish, follow up with details, don't leave anything undone. And the message that you got when you got there is it's up to you to get it done, find a way to do it. And I never, ever, after that, worried about everything that everybody else worried about. I focused on what I thought was important, and then I made it relevant. I did what was relevant to get it done.
Now, you finished at Citadel in 1965.
Yeah.
Now, I know you said you had a deferment, but that was basically the height of Vietnam.
It was.
Did you feel like that's something that was hanging over yourself and your classmates at the time? I know the kids today don't understand the draft and the things that we went through at the time. Did you think that was, did your classmates feel that was something hanging over them?
It was, because all of us thought we were going to Vietnam, and that's why I say I didn't expect not to go to Vietnam. I started to say I didn't mind going. I would have minded going. But it was a duty, and everybody was called. And we didn't, later they had a lottery with numbers and all that. With us, everybody went. And I lost two of my best friends in Vietnam the first year after we graduated. And they were both outstanding people. Both happened to be excellent football players, but aside from that, they were great people. I'm proud of this, so I'm going to take a minute to talk about it. I'm talking about Joe Massar and Skip Murphy. Skip Murphy was a walk-on at the Citadel in football, but he was the best in life before that. He was an Eagle Scout. His father was killed in World War II. He was raised by his mother and stepfather, who was a great person in his own right. And Murph walked on, ended up being the captain of the football team and all-conference center. Joe Massar came from a military family. His father was Marine colonel, but he was a football coach at Quantico. And Joe was recognized early on as a great college prospect. And the reason the Citadel got him, rather than a bigger school, was because his daddy was a Marine, and Bobby Schwartz had played at the Citadel, quarterback, and was at Quantico when Joe was there. And he said, "You got to get this kid, Coach T." Joe's the last man to make All-Southern Conference on both offense and defense. So he played both ways, and he made All-Conference both ways. He was named the outstanding player in the conference, All-State, every honor you could have. He was drafted by the Oakland Raiders. He declined that because he had a contract to go in. It was interesting because his dad was Marine. He chose to go in the Air Force. But when it came time to go, he switched to the Marines. He didn't have to go because his dad died his senior year at the Citadel, and his mom was home with three younger sisters, and he was going to be the sole support for them, and he could have gotten out of it, but he didn't, and he went anyway. He was killed in May of 1966. We graduated in May of 65. Skip Murphy was killed December 7th in 1966 in the rubber field plantation for the Michelin Tire Company. Joe was on patrol as a Marine lieutenant platoon leader and was killed by a mine. Somebody tripped. And Skip was in armored personnel, and there was a group of, I don't know if it was a platoon or a company, trapped in Michelin rice plantation. And he took his unit to get them out. And he did. He extricated them as they were going out. And those rice plantations, this is what we prepared for as military police. And these long dirt roads, the Viet Cong would plant mines along the roadways, and they'd plant people close enough that you couldn't, if you stood up with a 50 caliber machine gun and turned it upside down, you'd be over their head shooting. So these were very clever people, is what I'm trying to say. Getting back to Murphy, the thing was over. He had the troops saved. He's going down the way on one of these long roads, and he being the platoon leader was standing up in the turret looking all around and directing. They knew that he was a platoon leader, and when his armored personnel carrier went over a mine, they detonated. And it threw the whole thing up in the air, and it came down on Murphy, and it crushed him. And there's a fella who lives in Pennsylvania who was in the unit and was there when he died, and he's written it up. But both of these fellows were outstanding Americans, great guys and friends, and that's what we live with right out of the box after graduation. So when you talk about what it left with the society, it was an unpopular war for a lot of reasons and a lot of good reasons. But at the time, everybody that went was just doing what the country sent them to do, and that's the way we looked at it. I look at Normandy and D-Day now, and you listen to those people being interviewed, and they say, we're not heroes, we were just doing our job. That's what Murphy and Massar were doing. Anybody that was called went. Now, to your point, I regret that we don't have a draft for a lot of reasons. I will name a few because I want my family to hear this, my great-great-grandchildren. Number one, it brought everybody together. It didn't matter if you were a millionaire's son or if you came from the farm and didn't finish grade school. You went and served. They got to know each other. Races got to know each other. Kids that never had any discipline or any education got all of that together. And they learned to get along with each other and fight for a common good, a mission, and accomplish it. I'm preaching now, but I mean it. What we don't have now is that ability. You were invested in your country, and you felt good about it. Even though you lost friends, you might have lost a limb, you felt good about what you had done. Today, I resent the fact that we have people fighting under arms, and the only people know they're fighting are their families, because we don't pay any price for it. There's no rationing. Everybody continues as though there's no war going on. There's no price for any of us to pay. Unless you have a son or a daughter under arms, you don't know, and you largely don't care. And that's wrong. It's not what our Constitution envisioned. It's not what should be. But all these kids that are on the street corners selling dope, if they went to service and taught a trade and taught a mission and taught values, maybe they wouldn't be on that street corner, and they'd have some skills on top of it. But I will never go back to it unless we have another world war in which everybody has to go. If you instituted a draft right now, it wouldn't work, because it would not be the discipline, there'd not be the commitment, it would be chaos. And I regret that we're in that state, but we are, being blunt. Now, ergo Duffy on military and draft.
Well, let me ask you this question. Your two classmates you talked about who were killed in Vietnam, didn't you have something to do with getting a memorial for them?
I did, and I'm proud of that too. They went too long unrecognized because we were out trying to make our way after we got out to service and take care of our families. And on our 40th reunion from the Citadel, I got together a group and we commissioned a sculptor, and we raised the money to build a statue to the two of them. And I'm proud to say it sits outside the locker room as a Citadel football team takes the field. They reach up and touch that statue. And when I talk to the football team, as I do, to explain to them who these people are and why they're important, everybody loves tradition in football. Clemson comes down the hill. They got a rock Frank Howard went to the desert to get. Carolina plays Space Odyssey and blows smoke out of a cannon. We've got the greatest tradition at the Citadel anybody ever had, the citizen soldier. They laid it on the line on the football field, and they were excellent. They laid it on the line for their country. And the tradition at the Citadel is the men that wore the uniform before you. And they're right there before you, and you're in that huddle on Johnson Haygood Field. You can look up and see them. And that's what we want those football players to know and understand now. And it came off beautifully, and they now have it on the scoreboard at the Citadel, and it's introduced before every game, and the team embraces it. And I'm very proud of all that. But what we did do, so it wouldn't look just like our friends in our class, we made it a Vietnam memorial, and we have a base on which every Citadel man lost in Vietnam, his name is engraved by his class year and when he passed. And so we covered everybody.
Judge, you said that you became interested in going to law school when you took some courses at the Citadel, and then you got a deferment after the Citadel to go to law school. Where did you go to law school?
I went to Carolina, and again, it was in state, and that was where I was going to go. And I feel bad for kids today with tuition. Back when I went, it was $250 a semester to go to law school, and you could work in the summer and over the year and pay for your law school. And of course, that's what I did. But I went the first year, and my brother had been up there for a year, and he was a classmate with Joe Riley. And so I'd been at Citadel with Joe and Bishop England with Joe, and Bubba Unger from Walterboro was there. Mullins McLeod from Walterboro, Ed Brockington from Kingstree, and Larry and Michael Duffy, and that was a group. We lived in a shack on Divine Street, 1809 Divine. It was torn down after that.
Probably because you don't live there, it's torn down.
That's exactly right. But I was to report to law school, I mentioned earlier, I had a kidney stone, came 6 weeks late, found out that they had already crossed me off the rolls at law school. They didn't call on me. And so what I did after that was I stayed home and read skinnies and canned briefs trying to catch up because I was 6 weeks behind. And if I kept going to class every day, I'd never catch up.
6 weeks pretty significant in law school, I would think, especially the first year.
It really was. And the dean said, you can't do it, it's not going to work. So I was intent on making it work, but I couldn't do that and be in attendance every day listening to other law students give their brief. So I did it that way, and I got through and did fine first semester, and then it was smooth sailing after that. But it was a heck of an experience.
They still had just one exam like to do when I was there anyway.
One exam, and boy, it was scary because you never knew, as you said, it was all or nothing at all. And we had some great professors, and they scared you too.
Well, how many people were at law school, do you think, when you were up there, approximately?
It was relatively small. We were in the old Pettigrew building, which was the original law school at the time, and they've since built a new law school and yet another new law school. But my class was 165 people, and that's about what the other two classes combined were.
Right.
And they took that many people knowing they were going to fail them out just to prove they could fill up a new law school if Carolina would build it. So they told us that when we reported. They said, it's not a scare tactic that, you know, half of you will not be here at graduation time, so you better study hard. And they were correct. We took the bar exam at the end of the 3 years. There were 89 people. So they held true to what they had to say.
When you went up there, did they require to wear coats and ties?
Wore coats and ties to class every day, and it was the Socratic method. You'd be called on by a professor to come to the front of the room, particularly Coleman Carish, who taught contracts freshman year. And he would stand behind you with a cigar in his mouth, smoking, and blow smoke over your shoulder while you briefed the class on the case. And it was most intimidating, but wonderful professor. David Means was a property professor, and he would put his hands in his back pockets and stare at the ceiling and lecture for an hour, citing cases. And people always said he had Braille on his behind, and he was really reading while he was reciting. But that was the kind of atmosphere it was. It was one classroom, a huge amphitheater, and everybody was in there together. Later, they went in sections and all the rest of that, but we were all in one room together, and so you got to know each other pretty well in a hurry.
What were some of your favorite subjects in law school?
I always liked the trial subjects. I took a course in jurisprudence. Then I loved torts, constitutional law. I really enjoyed legal writing too, because I enjoyed writing, and I carried that with me throughout the legal career. I enjoyed writing briefs and proposed orders or anything else. And I tried to take some electives like the jurisprudence course, and I took a couple of others, but the meat of it, like evidence and your practice court case, I was fortunate enough while I was there. If you recall the old Pettigrew building, they had a small room that was set up as a courtroom, and freshmen or 1Ls would be the jury, and the 3Ls tried a case to that jury. And they'd have, I don't know, maybe room about this large for the audience to be. Well, the people at the, we used to call it the insane asylum on Bull Street, but at the mental hospital wanted forensic experience. So they came to the law school and they asked us to try a case and let them provide expert witnesses. I was chosen to be one of the lawyers to try that case. Brother Leesman and I were going to prosecute the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, and Jim Daniel and Bob Shaheen were going to defend Albert DeSalvo. And we got a chief resident as an expert, and they got a chief resident, and we tried it at the federal court in Columbia. And we had a gallery in the court of law students and doctors, and it was a great experience, and absolutely loved it. And we had a federal magistrate, Judge Taylor, was the presiding judge for that. But those are the things I fed on.
Did you have a moot court team back then, or did you do any of that?
We had a moot court competition, but I don't know. I didn't even go out for it because I'm giving a confession now. I took a job while I was in law school working for a sole practitioner in Lexington, Senator Albert Dooley. And I was going over there putting in all my time because I got paid $2 an hour again instead of $2 a night. And he let me draft pleadings, search titles. I was really learning as much or more in the afternoons in that law office than I was. So I didn't volunteer to go into moot court and stuff like that.
Now, I understand you also had a job as a milkman, is that correct?
That's true. One of the few fellows worked his way through law school as a milkman. Most kids, they don't know what a milkman is. But for my great-great-grandchildren, if they see this, a milkman used to drive a truck. We'll take a break now.
All right, Judge. You were getting ready to explain to me that you had a job as a milkman while you were in law school, and you were explaining to your grandchildren what a milkman is.
Yeah, I think I started explaining the milkman was a route salesman for a dairy that used to carry milk in bottles to the front door, and you could order whatever kind of milk you wanted, and butter, whatever, and during Christmas season, eggnog or whatnot. I had a job lined up before Kathy and I got married. They just started, I think how long ago this was, the Head Start program, and they were interviewing for the very first year. And I was in Columbia where I knew very few people, so I went and interviewed. They said, oh, you got a job, don't worry, you can work for us during the summer. So we went away on our honeymoon, and I came back and found out they had hired everybody while I was gone. They didn't say when the interviews were going to be. So I'm in Columbia as a married man. My wife's got a job as a public health nurse, and I'm just looking for the highest paying job I could find. I answered newspaper ads, and I ended up with the Coble Dairy. And I drove a truck, and they had strikers is what they called them. They were young boys who were minimum wage type people who would get out and deliver the milk from the truck to the porch or what have you. And in the city, that's very helpful because you had to park and do the rest of it. Well, they fired them because they wanted minimum wage. They were paid lower than minimum wage. So then the driver, meaning Michael Duffy, had to drive the truck, make the records, and get out in 95-degree heat and deliver the milk after having gotten up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do it, and then going back to the dairy afterwards and stock the truck for the next day. But I'm making the most money I can make. And I was joking about the $2 an hour. I don't know what it was, but it was better than that.
Now, Judge, I've known you a long time, and my experience is you don't really rise too early in the morning. How'd you get up at 4 o'clock?
I'll tell you what, it wasn't easy. But my new bride, God bless her, I insisted she not, but she got up and fixed me breakfast. Well, that lasted a week. But anyhow, I had an angel of mercy found out. I guess I was a milkman for 6 weeks of the summer, and Joe Riley's uncle, Jack Riley, a retired colonel in the Army, was head of special schools for the state of South Carolina, and they trained industry, a workforce for industry moving here at the state's expense. And he calls me and says, Michael, I've got a job I need somebody to do. Now, I know you got a good job, but I need somebody to go to these industries where we've trained the workforce and see if the people are still there, and if they're doing well, and if there are problems, document them. Now, you have an air-conditioned car. I'm driving a milk truck with no air conditioning and no brakes one time. But he rescued me, and I went to work doing that for the rest of the summer. Great experience, went in all these plants and got to see how they operated and put together the data the state needed to find out whether the work program was efficient once it was implemented in the industries.
Okay. Now, you finished law school in what year?
1968.
68, and you immediately took the bar exam?
Took the bar exam, and we finished in May. Took the bar exam at the end of June. And I was kind of burned out at that point, and I was, again, out of the ordinary in the sense of not having good sense. I said, Kathy, I got to get away from here. I'm not going to hole up in a carrel in the library for a month getting ready. So we went on a vacation for 2 weeks and drove up the coast. When I got back, I was petrified. And so the adrenaline was flowing, and I concentrated tremendously well. But I had 2 weeks to get ready for the bar, and I did. And I've forgotten how many subjects you could take in law school versus how many were tested on the bar. There were like 6 or 8 areas that you couldn't take all of them. So what I did for the others is I got a skinny or canned brief or whatever it would have been and read the state code in the areas that I had not had a formal course. And we had a 3-day bar exam. It was at the South Carolina Supreme Court, which at that time was housed in the State House, not across the street in the post office building. So we were seated around tables at the Supreme Court. And as I said, there were 89 of us taking the bar exam. And it was a marathon, and it was an endurance contest. It was all essay. There were no, whatever that national test is called now.
Multiple choice thing.
Yeah, none of that. Everything you had to answer, and it was a fact situation you responded to. And I thought one of the more difficult things was to identify the issue they wanted you to discuss, because sometimes you'd have 2 or 3 issues wrapped in it, and you didn't know which one they were looking for. So I would pick the one I thought was appropriate, and I'd make a note at the end. I noticed these other issues that I would have addressed, and I would give a sentence or 2 about how I would approach it and just hope they would accept it. If I picked the wrong one, they at least knew I recognized the others. Anyway, I passed the bar exam.
And how long did it take you to get your results, if you remember?
We got the results in October. And, it seemed like forever, and it does every year. But I don't know when they get them back now, maybe same time.
About the same time, yeah.
Yeah. But it was a funny experience in the sense of comparing notes as you left each morning or each afternoon for the session. and everybody would say, "Oh no, oh yes," that kind of thing.
That's the way it always is. They saw an issue you didn't, and you saw one they
That's
didn't see,
right.
and that type of thing. So, all right. So, after you finished, after you got your results in October, when did you go into service?
I was supposed to report, as I told you, I was delayed. So I was supposed to report January the 12th, which I did. I was hoping for an earlier date. But since I couldn't, I came back to Charleston and found a job. First of all, there was this priest who was a great influence in my life I mentioned earlier, Father Huback, was a pastor at Blessed Sacrament Church over on Savannah Highway. And they had a school, still do, Blessed Sacrament, 8 grades. And they had no males on the faculty. So he asked me, would I teach there pending my reporting for service? So I did, and I would teach in the mornings, and I'd go to work for the Neighborhood Legal Assistance Program on Spring Street in the afternoon. And there's a gentleman from Columbia whose name I've forgotten because he wasn't there very long. It was something like Akins, but he got in trouble and was removed. And Danny Martin was the vice chair, and he moved up to being the chair. The lawyers, in addition to those two, were Helen Earhart and Bill Runyon. And so when I came on, like any other new start, I got a lot of interesting cases assigned to me immediately. And so I would go teach school in the mornings and work there in the afternoons, and I loved it. It was interesting both ways. What was interesting, too, is teaching school, which I had never done. And some of the people in the class, one of my students, and he mentioned it when it was Mike Bennett, when they cut the ribbon for the Bennett Hotel, he referenced the fact that I taught him when he was in the 6th or 8th grade. And I did, and I varied the classes because I didn't take a course in teaching to make them interesting the way I would have wanted them if I were a student. I think the kids responded to that. And I would have open debates. And for example, I'm getting ready to go to Vietnam, but I would challenge the kids and say, why are we going to Vietnam? That's a civil war. We got no business over there. And I get parents calling me and all kinds of things. But I got the kids thinking, and it was a great experience.
So what were you doing at Neighborhood Legal?
Anything that came through the door, which was mostly family court work, some criminal defense and magistrate court cases, and petty crime type things.
So this was after you had your bar results, but before you went in the Army.
Well, it started before I got the bar results, and that was the problem because, see, I started there, I'm thinking I was teaching in September, and I started there maybe just before that. And we moved and all that took time. But I think once I got the bar results, I did go to General Sessions Court and Common Pleas, but I'd forgotten the time frame.
Now, was there a story about you meeting a client, reviewing the file, and starting to try the case in 15 minutes one time when you were at Neighborhood Legal, or was that somewhere else?
Well, back then it wasn't unusual. When I came back from the Army, I was the assistant county attorney, and I prosecuted in the juvenile court. And they would give me, not on Friday, but on Monday, the list of files of cases that are going to be tried on Monday. And I would meet with a police officer and witness. Usually it was minor kind of crimes, but sometimes you'd have just a police officer as a witness. Sometimes you have one or two others. And of course you got criminal defense lawyers. I got to meet every lawyer in town, and you're in front of a judge, and it doesn't take time drawing juries or any of the rest of that. I ended up one day in front of Judge Craven. We went till 10 o'clock that night, and I tried 12 different cases that I'd just seen that morning. So you learned how to act on your feet. Maybe the other case you might have been thinking about was, I put it this way to law students and people when I talk to them, we didn't have this requirement to go watch trials after you got admitted to the bar before you could try a case or something. And the very first real trial, not my practice court case in law school, but the first trial I ever saw, I was the plaintiff's lawyer. And I won the case or I wouldn't be talking about it. But there's a name for that, and I tell people today it'd be malpractice. But back then, that's what everybody did. You got a client, you got your file, and you went and tried the case. It was Mr. Berry versus Roland Rubber Company. And I could try it right now because it's so indelibly marked on my mind. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but Falcon Hawkins had given me office space to use. And when I came back, he said, I'd meant to go down there with you. You already tried the case? I said, yeah. He said, how'd you do? I said, I won. He said, well, it's a good thing I didn't go.
That's right. Well, let me ask you, when did you come back from the Army?
I got out of the Army just before Christmas in '71. In fact, this is kind of interesting to whomever was in the Army. I had a port call on January 10th, which meant I had to stay there for Christmas and New Year's. If you had January 3rd, they would move you out before Christmas and you go home for Christmas. Well, I thought that was not too equitable since I had a son born in Germany, Patrick, who no one had ever seen, and I wanted to go home for Christmas. So I called the Pentagon every night for about 6 nights in a row.
That's an authority thing again.
Yeah, I'm in Germany and I'm calling the Pentagon. And my battalion commander's going berserk. He thinks I'm going to get him in trouble.
Yeah.
And he was kind of a fellow that wasn't, well, he was afraid of his shadow. But anyway, I'd call every night and ask the guy. And finally he said, I guess it's all right. I took that from my Citadel training as being approval. I said, thank you. So I went to the Sergeant E8 that was in charge of personnel. Said, I got vocal orders approved to go home. I flew out on the last plane, December 21st, got home for Christmas with Katie and Patrick and Kathy. I mustered out January 12th in Fort Jackson.
Now, when did you start looking for a law job after you got out of the Army?
Actually, I started looking before I got here. I wrote my brother, Angelo Riley. I said, do you know anybody in town that needs a lawyer? I've had no time to write letters or seek interviews, and both of them said to me, talk to Falcon Hawkins. They used to have a number of lawyers at Hollings and Hawkins, and some of them have gone, and he may be interested. I talked to him. He said, I don't need any lawyers, he said, but I'll tell you what. I've got empty offices, and I'll let you use one of them. And when you start making money, you can pay me some rent as you think you can. And he let me use one of his secretaries. I said, well, nobody could ask for more than that. Thank you, sir. That's what I'd like to do. I hung out a shingle, and I was in his offices. Never forget, it was in January of '72, and I walked back up from East Bay Street to Rutledge Avenue. We were staying with Kathy's mother on Rutledge, and the sun was setting. And I said, I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, going to practice law after all these years of waiting to do it. And I felt like I was on top of the world. And I took everything that came through the door. And back then, it was interesting. I didn't particularly care for property work, but it was good work. And my friend Jimmy Kerr.
It paid money.
It did, that's right. And on time, hired me to do one of the first planned unit developments of PUD. I didn't know what a PUD was when I started. And I did one for him, and that's the kind of thing you did. And then to get trial practice, they didn't have a neighborhood legal, but they had a lady in town, God bless her, I can't remember her name, great lady, who got some funding from the federal government to do that kind of work, but it wasn't called a public defender or anything. She was there, it was like neighborhood legal to help anybody that had a problem. But she didn't like court. So she'd get cases, and if it looked like it was going to court, I'd take them and try them for her. And I just enjoyed the practice. And I guess I got reimbursed cost or something. I don't know if I got paid anything for doing it, but I got a lot of experience. I could talk about some stories, but we're not going to do it. But that's the way you had to get experience. At the end of the year, I ended up making a grand total of $12,000, which back then was more than most new lawyers were making. So I considered it a successful year.
Oh, $12,000 big money back then. Yeah.
And Falcon considered it that. And by the way, I was paying him rent. I went in and paid him rent. And so at the end of that year, he asked me to join him, and it was Hollings and Hawkins, but the three lawyers were Falcon and our friend George Morris, same one who was in Citadel with me in the same company, and then me. And shortly thereafter, after I joined the firm, Sid Boone came, and he was Falcon's relative by marriage. And shortly after him, David Hawkins came, who was Falcon's younger brother, separated by like 16 years. And we practiced that way until, and I'm trying to remember the succession of when lawyers came.
Let me stop you for a second. Yeah. I was going to ask you a couple of things. First of all, I thought about talking about watching trials and all. Did you ever go down to the old courthouse when they had the gallery? You could watch the trials.
Oh, it was neat. It was like they had box windows looking into the courtroom, and they had little steps there for people that couldn't see to stand up. You could watch a trial without disturbing anyone. And anytime there was a big trial in town, if it was standing room only kind of thing, all the lawyers would go back there and look through the windows. One of those cases that I'm describing was the death of a very popular fella in town named Josie Moloff. He owned a liquor store, and he was executed during a robbery. And it led to a great story from one of the criminal defense lawyers we laugh about a lot because he was such a colorful guy, Demetrius John Stratus, known as DJ, and he defended the trigger man, or one of the trigger men. He said it was Booper Pritchard's client, but somebody else said it was his client. And I listened to his opening statement, which in essence said, I didn't want this job, but I had to do my duty. You might not want to decide this case, but you got to do your duty and be fair. And it was much more colorful the way he put it, but it was the kind of thing people would do standing behind that glass watching.
That's something that I think they miss with the new courthouse, that you can't do that for young lawyers' point of view anyway. Let me ask you about going back to Hollings and Hawkins. Tell me about Fritz Hollings.
Fritz Hollings was always larger than life to me. I first met him when I was 10 years old. Didn't know who he was, of course. My grandmother was a ward healer kind of a lady, and talking about my grandmother Cantwell. Her name was Cleo Victoria Cantwell, so somehow she got the nickname Dyke, which didn't mean back then what it does now. But she worked in the polls all the time, and for $10, she got me a job, and I guess I was 10 or 12, and they'd pay you $10 to work all day in the polls, running messages and doing errands for people, and you got a free chicken dinner, and I would have done it for the chicken dinner. But this big commotion started in the precinct when then Representative Hollings came in from the State House, and I mean, he looked like the senator from Central Casting, as they said, when he was in the Senate. But when he was younger, he was just a heartthrob, and all the young girls and women went gaga when he arrived, and I knew who he was because of that.
Did you actually have a practice with him? His name was just on the door when it was Hollings and Hawkins?
Well, what happened was, you used to, if somebody went to the Senate, they would leave their name on the practice on the building, on the shingle, because if they got defeated, they could come home to their practice if they wanted instead of giving it up. There was a relative of the Kennedys who was Sergeant Shriver, and he was in the Senate and also a lawyer, and he had his name on his shingle back at the old firm. And I've forgotten why he got entangled with something. So the Senate passed a rule saying any senator that had a law practice had to take the name off of it. And so they did, and it went from that. And then they were sitting and talking about, we were, what to name the firm. And George Morris, of course, was the senior person behind Falcon, and George's mother was a wonderful lady and an old world Greek, and she kept telling George one day he'd be the big lawyer. And and sure enough, when the opportunity came to rename the firm, Falcon said, well, we can name it Hawkins and Morris. And he looked at me and said, if you want to put Duffy, and he looked at Sid and said, if you want to put Boone, David said, I already am a Hawkins. I don't need mine. And I said, look, I think that is really too much on a shingle. Just make it Hawkins and Morris. And that's how it was for a number of years until Falcon went to the bench in '79. And then we became Morris, Duffy, and Boone.
Okay. I understand you do a Fritz Hollings impression. Can you do that for me?
Well, goddamn, what do you want me to say? He can use that word, and he used to kneel down on his knees before he went to bed at night and said his prayers. So it was no disrespect to the Lord, but he could take the Lord's name in vain and use it as a noun, a verb, an adjective, and it was part of his speech.
The senator.
He came up to me as a result of what you're talking about, being able to pick up a case and go try it. Michael, you tell me you can try a case cold. I said, Senator, what does it mean trying a case cold? He said, pick up the file and go to the courthouse and try it. I said, well, I've done that, and I won. I said, but I don't seek those cases. But he was just a great fellow. When he came back into town, we did a lot for him, of course, while he was in D.C., representing his friends and clients and family, and it was good for all of us. And certainly we all benefited from him having started the firm and still had clients that he had brought to the firm. So I got to know him more then from doing things for him, helpful to him, and was glad to do it, and glad for the time with him whenever it came.
Tell me about Falcon Black Hawkins as a law partner, not as a judge.
Falcon Black Hawkins was, without a doubt, the kindest and most generous man, just as I described the way he treated me, offering a law office and use of a secretary. He was just a good man. But what people didn't understand, he was also a very bright man, because Falcon grew up kind of with a country approach to things, laid back, and also to the English language. It was kind of a laid-back country approach. And he might, from time to time, slaughter the King's English because he knew he was doing it. It didn't bother him. It was habit, and he just did. And he would meet people from all over the place, like F. Lee Bailey from Boston, and they would take him for a bumpkin, which was the worst mistake they ever made. And particularly lawyers on the other side, he would go have them in a box and wrapped up and sent off before they even realized it. He was that bright and hardworking. He and Patty Cassell, who was Patty Igoe, and she worked for Senator Hollings, and then she married Bobby Cassell, and she continued to work for Falcon Hawkins. And when he came to the bench, she came with him, and they used to refer to my assistant, Cindy Hubbard, as Judge Cindy. Well, Patty was the first judge assistant in the courthouse, and the fellow we were talking about earlier, probation officer, in the last month, emceed his retirement, said that. He said she was the first secretary that was a federal judge because she set her own rules. But he would sit and work till 7, 8 o'clock at night. But with Patty, what they would do is, I caught on to this later, they would come in and set the stage and farm stuff out, Falcon, to get us to do things. And I'm not sure they got seriously to work until after lunch, but they stayed till 7, 8 o'clock every night.
Tell me about some of the clients that I assume as the firm got larger that maybe the clients got larger also as far as money clients, I guess. Is that correct?
That's true. I think one of the first clients with any continuing practice and large was the Piggly Wiggly stores. Mr. Joe Newton brought that business to Senator Hollings when he was there, and he and Falcon did a great job for them. And as Fritz said, I'm a show horse, I need a workhorse. Well, he got Falcon, who was a workhorse, and they solidified the representation of Piggly Wiggly stores. And they were in South Carolina and some in Georgia. Had one in Texas. I think we had 113 separate stores, and then the Piggly Wiggly Carolina company was a warehouse supplied the groceries. That carried a large part of our practice for a good long time. Then we got cases because of that representation, like there's a client came to town in asbestos litigation. It was a company being sued, National Gypsum Company out of New York, and they came to me, Falcon was already gone, to represent them. And I think they came because somebody told them, well, that firm was started by a U.S. senator and a federal judge, so you got some people ought to know what they're doing. And I got the practice, and I ended up working in asbestos for a good long time all over the country, and was a liaison counsel for the defense group in asbestos in buildings, and we tried the very first case in the country up in Greenville. But those are the kind of cases that would come to you. In Buckner Land, the Northwoods Mall was the largest mall in South Carolina at the time, and the owner was a Buckner Land Company, a group of people who had come from Alabama, tradesmen and businessmen. It was almost like a religious cult that moved from state to state setting up businesses. And the roof leaked on the mall, and so it was 8 acres of roof. And the target defendant was Celotex. Well, Celotex engaged us, and Falcon and I went down to Tampa, Florida, to a roofing school put on by Celotex. And by the time we finished, I could put on a built-up roof. Falcon went to the bench just before the case was to be tried, and this was in '79. So I ended up trying the case with Michael Scardato's help. There was a case that was a marker, a landmark in South Carolina litigation called Campus Sportswear, and that was a suit against a Celotex product called Bondply. And plaintiffs recovered, but Judge Hemphill also allowed the roofer to cross-claim against the company, and they recovered $250,000. So that's why we ended up with Celotex business. And I tried that case for about a month, and Michael helped me with it. And Governor McMaster's father,
George, geez, I'm just losing the name. All of them have 2 names, and he's a great gentleman, and I liked him, and he and I were friends for life. I'll give you that in a minute. But anyway, he came and observed the trial and report back to Celotex because he had represented him. And he was very complimentary of our efforts, and it was very, very good. I'm getting George Dean Johnson mixed up with the McMasters, but anyway, as a result of that, we got all the Celotex business, and I was trying cases all over the country for them as well. And so, yeah, that came from that kind of relationship. I'm going to go into the McNair firm in a second, but I was going to ask you about some of your legal organizations you belonged to while you were practicing with Morris, Duffy, and so forth.
The first, we all belonged to the Charleston County Bar, which we loved, and the South Carolina Bar. And then the first honorary group that came to town, certain things like the College of American Trial Lawyers or what have you, are things that came to you later in your practice. But this group came in 1988, American Board of Trial Advocates out of California.
That's a BOTA.
A BOTA, yeah. Yep. And they recognized masters of trial, as they call it. And they invited a group in Charleston, and I've forgotten how many were invited. I think it was 25 or 30, and their deal was it had to be half plaintiff and half defendant, because their premise was that the Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial was sacrosanct, and that they wanted both plaintiffs and defendants involved, the best trial lawyers involved, to protect and perpetuate the sanctity of the jury trial. So they came to town with that pitch. And when they left town, 15 of us joined. Some of the older lawyers like Joe McGee and those invited didn't join, but Rutledge Young and myself and numerous others, Cody Smith and all like that, did join. And we had a chapter, first one in South Carolina, and they now have them across the state. And they asked me to be the national representative. So I went to all the national meetings and got to meet a lot of great lawyers and represent the group. And then after that, I was the president of the chapter, and we helped them get started in Columbia with the Abota group up there. But it was a good experience.
I want to ask you about, I understand that you play golf.
I used to be a half decent golfer, but I'm about ready to quit.
I remember a story you used to tell about when the Fourth Circuit panel was in town one time, about you organizing a golf outing for the Fourth Circuit. Can you tell that?
Falcon Hawkins called me, and Judge Chapman was in town. I think that's probably the one you got in mind. And he said, "Michael, Judge Chapman wants to play golf. Why don't you get a fourth and we'll play?" He said, "But get somebody good, because Judge Chapman's really a good golfer, and we want a good foursome." I said, "Okay." So all the young lawyers I called were busy, couldn't go. So I called this fellow who was famous as a golfer at the country club, one of the owners in the old stock issues at the country club in Charleston, Pete Peterson. And Pete was an old government contract lawyer, irascible, and just didn't much care for the formalities of life. I said, "Pete, can you play?" He said, "Yeah, I'll be glad to play." We're on the first green at Snee Farm, and it was new and nice course back then. And Judge Chapman and Pete each had about a 3 or 4 foot putt. And Judge Chapman said, "Pete, good, good." In other words, let's give each other the putt. And Pete said, "No, let's putt them out." So Pete made his and Judge Chapman missed his. And we're walking back to the golf cart. I said, "Pete, this is a friendly match, and you're telling the man to putt out on gimme putts." He said, "I don't have any cases in federal court. I don't care."
Let me ask you about practicing law in Charleston back, I guess, prior to McNair firm and even at the McNair firm. But back in those days, and I don't think young lawyers today can really can identify with these days, but the days before cell phones, the days before computers, no emails, no fax machines. I mean, how was that back then?
It was kind of the Wild West as far as law practice was concerned, and you sought help wherever you could get it. Excuse me. Byers Drugstore right here on Broad Street was where lawyers gathered at 10 o'clock in the morning for a cup of coffee, take a morning break. If you were a young lawyer and you needed help, you'd go to Byers Drugstore and seek out the older lawyers, and they were more than happy to talk to you and offer suggestions and help you. And then you bonded with them as well. It was a great, great milieu and crucible to get together.